Welcome everybody, and thank you for joining us for this webinar. On behalf of me and Ingo. So just a quick introduction. My name is Vasil Michev. I'm an Office 365 MVP and have been working with Office 365 ever since it got released, what's now 9 years ago. And big part of this has been working with the Exchange Commandlets. So I can pretty much say I've been raised by playing with those commandlets for the past 9 years. And we've also asked here Ingo to join us. He's also a fellow Microsoft MVP, but we will use his expertise as an administrator and one of the bigger Office 365 customers with large number of seats, and he will be basically able to give us the real life experience. Ingo, if you can introduce yourself real quick.
Yeah, hello, nice to have you here. My name is Ingo Gegenwart. I'm working for SAP. So I'm also a Microsoft Certified Master. And just to give you also an idea here, our environment currently has roughly 130,000 user mailboxes plus a 10 to 15,000 shared and room mailboxes. And actually we came for SAP from on-prem, and we went the whole road down to Exchange Online right now. So we know all of the environments, and with disadvantages and advantages, yeah, we have the full-blown experience here as well. We hopefully can share here and helps for you. With that, let's start, Marcel.
Thank you, Ingo. So yeah, let's go ahead and get started. And first, let's introduce sort of what's the issue here. Why do we want to cover this topic and what's new on it? So as an Exchange administrator, you're most likely aware of Exchange Online PowerShell and have been using it for a while. You're pretty much aware how it works, I suppose. And those of you that are on-premises administrators as well should be familiar with it. Exchange in particular is probably the primary workload for, well, the workload that takes fuller advantage from PowerShell compared to all the other ones. So you should be familiar with it, so to say. So how does Exchange Remote PowerShell work? Basically, it's designed for a world where you are managing your local infrastructure and not designed for the cloud. So with applying the same basic principles for connectivity to Exchange Online, we've started seeing some issues. And most of you have, for example, seen issues with the amount of time it takes to actually perform basic tasks because of the data that has to actually travel through the wire, or you've seen frequent disconnects or throttling messages, error messages like this one, I suppose, are very familiar to most of you. And yeah, so over the course of the past few years, we've repeatedly run into issues like that, and just trying our best to go and make sure that our scripts are able to complete it. We've simply come across several different tips that can help us address the most common issues. I see that somebody here is actually complaining about audio issues. Just a quick check here, Ingo. Emma, can you hear me okay?
I can hear you perfect.
Okay, thank you. Okay, so moving on. Just a quick summary of the most common tips. We've actually covered those in a previous webinar by me and now on actually 2 webinars. And yeah, just to give you the short version here, there are several things you can try. Basically, stuff like using the invoke command method, which basically allows you to run the well, let's say given script block directly on the server side, and then you can sort of instruct the server to give you back just the data you need. If we have enough time, I will make sure to do some demos here again just to give you the real comparison, but for the interest of time, I've just taken a quick screenshot of how things differ. So if you go from bottom to the top, you will see me running the get mailbox commandlet 10 times basically for my own environment. You can see that it usually completes in less than a second. Now, using the invoke command method, I can still use the same commandlet, and you can see that there is sort of an improvement, but it's not really visible. And the actual real improvement that we get is when I use the invoke command method, but basically tell the server to just give me back only the parameter, the attributes that I care about. In this case, I've given the example of just getting back the name and the external directory object ID. And as you can see from the result, they're pretty much twice as fast. And this is just for a smaller environment. I think I have like 29 mailboxes or so. You can, of course, get more and more speed improvement with a larger number of mailboxes. But yeah, that's just one of the tips that we have. Other tips include making sure that you use filtering to just get the data that you care about. For example, if you want to set some property on just the user mailboxes, it doesn't make sense to use the get mailbox commandlet unfiltered, because it will return you all the room mailbox, shared mailbox, and so on. And of course, there are many different examples of filters we can talk about. Again, if we have sufficient time, we can go over some additional examples there, but for the interest of time, again, just a simple screenshot here presenting you how you can use server-side filters to basically fetch, for example, just the mailboxes created on a given date or after a given date, or the mailboxes that are currently put on hold, or all the groups a particular user is a member of, and stuff like that. So moving on, one of the common tips that we, well, maybe not even a tip, but the common methods we use sometimes is to just pipe things together, pipe several commands together. It's quite easy to actually do so, and it allows you to perform some of the basic tasks. But when it comes to actually more complex tasks, more complex scenarios, it's not a very good idea to use this method, because you're losing a lot of the flexibility you have there. You cannot put any meaningful error handling, for example. If something happens, it just breaks, and so on. So one of the other tips we covered previously is to try and use your own script blocks or functions instead of using just piping where possible. Moving on, other similar tip is just to reuse the data where possible. So again, pipeline doesn't really help you with that, but you can store, for example, the output in a variable or save it to a file and then reuse it later. And you can also take advantage of other methods which are currently available. For example, even back in the day, we had the MSO module, which we could use to get a list of users and group in the organization instead of having to rely on the Exchange commandlets. Nowadays, we also have the Azure AD commandlets for that, or the Graph API. And Ingo, for example, can give you some rough estimates of how much of improvement you can get from using those methods instead of the Exchange Online commandlets. Ingo?
Yeah, this is also, I just wanted to mention the point here is use Azure AD, or for instance, when you're in a hybrid environment, use Active Directory. Just retrieve data what you really need, for instance, from Azure AD or from Active Directory directly, because this is much more faster than going through Exchange, because Exchange anyways, it's gonna ask and query Azure AD or Active Directory, but it's much slower. So you can combine that stuff. And the same also to add here another comment for piping and server-side filtering. This is also, think about every query you send to the server without filtering, all the responses had to come back to your shell. So that means a massive amount of data needs to be transported. And the finer you get your result, or you're from the whole object, so you're just selecting a few attributes, the less you have to transport through the terminal to your PowerShell, to your local PowerShell, which then speeds up everything. Also reduces the amount of memory you're using. Okay, go back to you.
Thank you, Ingo. And yeah, that's another example here, just some numbers on the screen. You can see a four-time improvement when you are getting fetching the list of users, and tenfold improvement when we are fetching the list of groups in the organizations. But anyway, moving on. Another tip we can give you is, of course, to add some proper error handling where possible, and also to re-establish sessions periodically, because as the screenshots we had on the previous slides, you see this, you saw the disconnect error there, basically, which most of you have run into one form or another. And basically, if you combine all these tips, you can sort of improve the whole situation there. And one gentleman from Microsoft by the name of Matthew Bird has actually done this for us and has released a module which basically incorporates most of those tips. It's called the Robust Cloud Command module. Previously, it was released as just a script, and you can find later on a link here to the original article and the more recent article that he released, I think, a month or two back, and also a link to the GitHub repository where you can get the module from, or you can even contribute to the module. And just to share one of the other tips that we shared on our previous webinars, is this was basically to use multiple accounts when you have to run a script or just collect data for a large number of accounts there. And in a nutshell, yeah, you can do things in parallel, split things into batches and stitch the data back together. All of this is available on demand if you have interest, but we are gathered here today to cover the newer stuff. So let's finish up with this overview of what was bad, so to say, in the Exchange Online commandlets, and switch to what's new and good. And again, just to continue setting the stage for the actual problem, a quick overview of how remote PowerShell works in the case of Exchange Online, let's say. So basically, we have the client, which connects to a front-end server, and then the front-end server speaks to the backend, which actually does the execution. The backend then returns the data, and it travels all the way back to the client executing it. And the process here can fail on multiple steps. Again, just because because it can fail on so many steps, we've seen various types of errors there, and you are probably familiar, not just those disconnects, but the annoying messages telling you that there was an error and some change occurred in the domain controller or something like this. One of the reasons here is because those sessions were stateful. They relied on the server you're connecting to, so if something happened with the server, everything goes poof. They didn't have any resume or retry capabilities. So again, if something happened, you had to start from scratch. No support for pagination. As we already spoke on the previous slides, it always returns the full object unless you do some tricks. And also there is the throttling issue and so on. So in summary, I mean, it's not that Microsoft was oblivious to those issues. They were pretty much aware of them, but it took them a while to actually present a solution which can help improve the situation. And those of you who have attended Ignite or have watched the recordings from Ignite are probably aware of it. I've actually borrowed those slides, those 3 slides from the presentation given at Ignite, BRK 3103, if I remember correctly. You will have the link later on in the sessions. Anywho, this is the solution proposed by the team at Microsoft, which helps us address most of those issues. So we still have, again, of course, the client connecting to the front-end server, but the front-end server now will use HTTP REST APIs to talk to the backend, and this improves things tremendously. There's also improvement in the way the actual business logic is executed, and in a nutshell, we have a bunch of improvements coming just from the switch from this model. First, and probably one of the most important stuff, the sessions are now stateless, and there is no server affinity. If something happens with the server, you are just redirected to the next available server, which in turn gives us then some retry, resume support. We also have support for pagination. We have this improved logic, which only returns a minimal set of attributes and greatly helps with increasing the performance, and some other stuff which we will cover. And we'll try to now switch to doing some demos. But before doing so, let's first give you an idea how you can get to the new commandlets. And you can do so by downloading the module, which is now distributed via the PowerShell gallery. The module is dubbed the Exchange Online V2 PowerShell, and it contains both the old style commandlets, so it still establishes this remote PowerShell session which fetches the commandlets from the Exchange Online server, but also includes a set of new REST-based commandlets, which we will see in just a minute here. But before that, we need to cover some other important stuff around the module just to make sure that you are actually prepared to run it. First of all, it only supports modern authentication. Now, most of you are probably aware that Microsoft is on their way to make sure that basic authentication is no longer used in the service. And this is a good thing, but in some situations you might have trouble connecting with modern authentication, in particular for scenarios which require automation. So you have to have this in mind when you try to adapt your scripts to use the new commandlets here. One other thing which was previously a problem for as you probably know, Microsoft released the modern authentication enabled module for Exchange Online a while back, but it didn't have proper support for delegation. So the latest version of the V2 module actually brings support for delegated access now. One of the other complaints that we had with the previous MFA module was that basically it came as this click once installer, which required you to use Internet Explorer or deploy plugins to be actually able to install it via other browsers. And this is no longer necessary because, as I mentioned above, the module is now distributed via the PowerShell gallery, so you can download it straight from PowerShell. And it's very important to also acknowledge the job that Microsoft has done here in the backwards compatibility section. We will actually have a separate slide on this and give you some example of what you can expect to work and some things that unfortunately still don't work, but we do have to give credit to the Microsoft folks on that side because, yeah, for the most part, you can actually interrupt between the old and the new commandlets. And one of the common questions, and probably a question we'll address in more detail later on, is support for PowerShell core scenario, PowerShell 6, PowerShell 7, Azure Cloud Shell, and stuff like that, and support for automation. Rest assured that Microsoft is well aware of those needs and is working on bringing a support in the future. And yeah, here's probably the best place to mention that they are actually planning to release new versions of the module every month. And just last week, they released this updated version, which brought us delegated support and some other improvements. So yeah, before switching to the actual
Just
demo.
to be clear, sorry, Vasil, one more thing here. When you go one slide back, even when you talk about the old Cmdlets, yeah, they are in one place. You just have to install one module. The good thing is here about the authentication method and the resilience of the connectivity. Also, the old Cmdlets, they leverage the new capabilities. So you will have all the advantages. So don't forget about the old one. Just focus on this on the new one. Sorry.
No worries, Ingo. Thank you for this comment. So yeah, just preparing us to step through the demos. You will see when you connect with the actual module using the newly introduced Connect Exchange Online commandlet, it will give you a short information there and give you a list of the currently supported commandlets. It's important to understand that only a handful of commandlets are currently actually using this new REST-based infrastructure, but Microsoft is of course working to make sure others are brought in as soon as possible. Whether all the commandlets will actually be ported at some time, I'm not sure. It doesn't make sense probably to make this, but when it comes to the most used commandlets, Microsoft is trying to make sure it covers them. So this is basically the list. We will see again this in a minute here. Just to also continue.
And also the email address for giving feedback, right?
Oh yes, of course.
So don't hesitate. Give feedback to the folks. They need really feedback.
Yes, make sure to use the DL here to send them feedback, praise as well as needed, and so on. So just again to cover a bit more on the issue of basic authentication, because I know we had some questions around it. Again, the new commandlets, the ones that are using the new RESTful APIs, are only using modern authentication. But the other commandlets, those of you who have probably fiddled a bit about the way that PowerShell actually connects to do this, you see that it's still using the WinRM basic method from PowerShell, and it's sort of proxying the connectivity there. Instead of providing a username and password, you are providing a username and access token, but it's pretty much using the same endpoint there. So technically, it can still be considered a basic authentication approach. And the next screenshot basically illustrates this. So if you go ahead and simply disable basic authentication on your devices, which I know is something that at least in some organizations we are seeing now because of all the recommendations we have around disabling basic authentication across the stack. So if you go ahead and deploy a GPO or rec keys to disable basic authentication for WinRM, you will actually see that the module, the new V2 module, will fail to connect, and it will fail both the old style commandlets and the new style commandlets because of the way the current logic is implemented, as illustrated on the next screenshot here. So basically you have some part which connects to Exchange Online via the old method, and only after that the newer commandlets are loaded. And so if the first part fails, it all fails. And yeah, it's something that we've sent as feedback to the Microsoft folks, and they've promised that they will improve things in the future. So even if in situations where you have disabled WinRM basic authentication, you will still be able to use the new commandlets. So
maybe worth to mention, sorry, maybe worth also to mention that it's not only Exchange here, what you have seen before in the screenshot, it's WinRM, it's PowerShell. So the PowerShell team, they have some action also and some work to do.
Thanks, Ingo. So yeah, before switching to the demos, just to give you some more information about the Connect Exchange Online commandlets. So there's a few parameters that you might want to take advantage of. First of all, you can use the dash user principal name parameter to get a seamless single sign-on experience, which we will see in just a minute. There is also the /credential parameter when you want to connect as a different user. And I have, again, a note to make here, which again relates to basic authentication in one shape or form. So if previously you used the method of providing credentials via the for the old commandlets, you could do this, for example. So in the first line, I'm getting the credentials for a user and just pasting them to my connectivity script, which is basically establishing a session to old style session to Exchange Online. You can see that it's connected. Okay. Now this user is actually configured for is the subject of conditional access policy, so it should be meeting multi-factor authentication requirements. But because the old style commandlets simply use legacy authentication, basic authentication, it kind of bypasses this. Now, if I try to do the same by providing the same set of credentials to the newer V2 commandlets, you will see that the process will fail. So again, this is something that you have to have in mind when you are working with your scripts and automation solutions there. The new module only supports modern authentication, and you cannot bypass it. So we'll probably talk about this more in a second later on. But yeah, let's just cover the rest of the parameters that might be interesting for one reason or another. As I mentioned, the latest version now supports connecting to a partner organization via the delegated, as a partner organization, I meant, via the delegated organization parameter. And there is also the Exchange environment name parameter, which helps you connect to the Exchange Online backend if you are using Office 365 services in some of the sovereign clouds like the government cloud or the China, Germany, and so on. There's also a robust logging and telemetry, which you can get and examine in case you're running into some connectivity or other issues, and if in case you want to actually report some issues to the Exchange folks via the DL which we saw previously, you can use this parameter to actually expedite the process, prepare those logs, send them via attachment to the alias there. And yeah, there is also some additional information you can obtain by for running the commandlets via using the -verbose and -debug parameters. And yeah, that's pretty much all I wanted to cover as sort of preparation for actually switching to the demos. So let me exit from slides here and try and switch to the ISC. Yes, I am an ISC user, so we did actually have a question here whether you can run the commandlets in Visual Studio Code, Visual Studio Code, and so on. And yes, you can do it. The IC is even older technology, so you will see that they work here without a problem. So the first thing that I want to show you here is how we can actually connect. So we are running the connect exchange online commandlet with the dash user principal name, and I'm providing my UPN here. And let's see what happens basically. You might have just seen that the ADAO prompt appeared briefly for a moment. It didn't actually ask me to provide any information there because this is Azure AD joint machine, so it's already configured for single sign-on, and I was verified. My identity was verified successfully, and then the commandlets were loaded. You saw the familiar progress bar there, basically downloading all the commandlets to a file, and also we have now those additional commandlets. Now, I'm not sure if you can actually see the screen there because yeah, it's a bit like that, but I can try zooming in. Well, maybe not like that. Let me know. Ingo, can you
Oh,
actually
it's
see?
okay.
Okay.
It looks good. Should be good.
Okay, thank you. So yeah, let's one of the first things that we want to mention here is the obvious speed benefits. So as we mentioned previously, we did have some tricks how we can actually make the different commandlets run faster. So let's give you an example. The first thing that I'm doing here is again running get mailbox for my own tenant, running it 10 times and just fetching all the mailboxes in my own tenant. And you can see, yeah, on average, it should take about a second here. We have the first delay here, but yeah, in general, it should be around a second. Then if I move to the next line, eventually, this is the improved method, which I talked in the beginning, which basically running the invoke command and fetching just a few parameters in order to speed things up. So if we run it again 10 times, we can see yeah, that the result is much, much faster compared to what we had previously. And now we want to actually compare it with the new commandlet. So this time I'll be using the get exo mailbox commandlet, which is basically powered by the new infrastructure. Why cannot seem to move my cursor here? Give me a sec. Apologies, something is a bit slow. Let's try it like that. So again, running 10 times the same commandlet, well, getting the same result. The commandlet it's a bit different. It has the EXO prefix now, like all the other REST-based commandlets. So what you might observe in some situations is the first time when you run the commandlet, it's actually taking a lot of time to process. And this doesn't really comply with what we said previously about these speed improvements. Now, this is because Microsoft does some additional stuff on the backend to make sure that in the future, any subsequent runs of this commandlet will run faster. So the first run actually took about 16 seconds, but as you can see later on, the others completed in 0.3 seconds or stuff like that. And if I simply rerun this again, if I can go ahead and click there, it should be much faster now. As you can see, all the runs now are basically 0.3 seconds. So compared to the traditional get mailbox, we have a huge improvement here. And bear in mind that this is for my own tenant with just 23 mailboxes or so. Ingo later on will show you a real life example in his huge environment there, as we mentioned earlier, thousands upon thousands of mailboxes, and you will expect to see some large improvements. But before we switch to the Ingo's demos, let's give you some additional examples from other commands. So we can do pretty much the same comparison for the get recipient commandlet, which again should return a set of all the recipients in my tenant. In this case, it's about 89, 90 recipients, so it will take a bit longer to complete compared to the previous scenario when we were fetching just the mailboxes. But And the idea again is that you can expect some sort of improvements from running the newer commandlets. The second set of 10 runs of the get recipient is again using the invoke command method, so fetching just a few parameters. So it should be in theory a bit faster compared to the first one. Doesn't seem that it's that much faster today, but let's say we have 0.2, 0.3 seconds improvement or something like that. And after all, yeah, we are now interested in the newer commandlet. So if I try and run the get EXO recipient commandlet now against the same environment, we will see greater improvements here. So again, the first run it took a bit longer, 1.3 seconds, but all the subsequent ones were 0.3 or stuff like that. So let's try it again. We should avoid the first delay here. A bit of delay still, but anyway, the point is that you see something like a five-fold improvement in getting this data in my own small tenant. So as the number of objects grows in size, you can see larger and larger improvements there. Now you can do some other stuff here. Of course, as we mentioned, there is backward compatibility with most of the commandlets, so you can expect pretty much all the parameters to work. There are some exceptions which we'll cover in a moment. And for example, you can, but for example, you can still use stuff like filter to fetch just the objects that you need. In this case, what I'm using is filtering out a particular mailbox. You will see why in a minute, but the commandlet is fetching again all the mailboxes in my tenant, and for each mailbox it's running the get mailbox statistics commandlet. It will take a bit longer now because we are piping two commandlets together and we are piping them for a bunch of mailboxes. But while this runs, I will try to explain why exactly I'm excluding this particular user. So this user is actually a guest user created in my tenant, and as some of you might be aware, guest users have a special sign in their UPN. And unfortunately, at this point in time, the Exchange Online module, and as some of you might actually be aware, the Graph APIs seem to have issues with some of the special characters there. So in this case, this is the oh, actually, I'm not sure how it's called in English, the hashtag character, I believe. And it's the one that's causing trouble. I think I have a screenshot on it later, so I will not just run it here, but yeah, in general, you can see it's a bit slow, so I'll just not wait for it to complete. You can see the best we got here is 10 seconds or so. So let's try the same scenario now with the newer commandlet. So if I get again the same list of mailboxes, the same list of mailboxes, and try to get the mailbox statistics for each of them 10 times, well, let's see what sort of improvement we can expect by using the new commandlets. Again, we are piping the get EXO mailbox commandlet against the get EXO mailbox statistics commandlet. So again, the first run as usual, a bit slow, that's just warming up, but once we get past it, we can see it takes half a second on. So now compare this to the 10 seconds that we had previously, you can see that obviously this is a great improvement. So yeah, kudos to the Microsoft folks for providing us with this newer methods. So the last demo I want to run here is getting the mobile device statistic, which is traditionally one of the the slowest commandlets that we had in Exchange Online. So again, if I do this, I will just do this once now because it takes a lot of time here. So if I just fetch a list of all the mailboxes in my tenant, excluding this problematic one, and then use it to fetch all the mobile device statistics for each mailbox, I will be able to then return all this data in about half a minute or so, if I'm lucky. And
Here,
then,
this takes ages because
yeah.
it really opens up the mailbox and retrieves the data there, right, for each.
Oh, yeah, almost 30 seconds. I was correct here.
Yeah.
So if I go ahead and try to do the same via the new commandlet, so first of all, if you simply examine the code that I'm running, you might notice that I'm actually able to pipe it directly to the get EXO mobile device statistics commandlets, which is something new. Again, we talked about why piping might not be the best idea, but in some simple scenarios, it makes actually sense to use it where possible. So let's see how long it actually takes to do this same task via the new commandlets. Just 4 seconds compared to the 30 seconds we had previously, and it's just a single run here. So yeah, as you run more and more of these, you can expect lots and lots of improvements. So I have some other examples here, but because pretty much they revolve about the same, it's always improvement in favor of the new commandlets, and it doesn't make sense to just waste additional time to run them. So let's switch to something else, basically the topic of the backwards compatibility. So as we mentioned initially, there is a somewhat changed logic when you run the new commandlets. By default, they return only a minimum set of parameters. Actually, I should have included a simple example here, I suppose. So let's do a get exo mailbox. And let's see what the result will be. Instead of the 200 or so attributes that we are usually getting via the get mailbox commandlet, we have just a handful here. And just this simple fact brings us a bit improvement in terms of performance when we are running more and more of those commandlets. Now, of course, you will have situations where you actually want to include some additional parameters, or in some cases, even all parameters. So if you want to do this, you have to use the new property sets parameter. So there are a bunch of those. The slides will actually list them later on. I think for get TXO mailbox, we have like 15 or even more of those. There's a bunch of parameter sets for get EXO recipient and so on. But the idea here is, again, you can actually specify which set of attributes you want returned, or in some cases, you might actually even include additional parameters that you care about instead of getting the set. So the first example, we are basically, apart from the set of attributes that are returned by default, we are requesting the parameters, the attributes which relates to the host and functionality and all the policies assigned to the mailbox. And yeah, as you can see from the output here, we have the retention information, for example, and the host information and stuff like that. And the next example is basically combining the two, getting a specific property set and also calling out for a property like the in-place host directly. And yeah, this is basically the logic that you can use to adjust your script where needed to give you just the data you need. There is also some talk we need to do for explaining how recipients are being resolved. And I think I should have the examples somewhere here, or maybe I didn't. Okay, we'll switch to the slides later on and I'll talk about it. Before doing so, let's cover a bit about filters as well. Again, it's we still have the filter parameter. In some cases, at least, we have the backwards compatibility compared to what we had previously with the get mailbox commandlet, for example, and the litigation hold enabled filter here. So I can pretty much run the same filter for the get EXO mailbox commandlet, and I can either enclose the filter condition there in squiggly brackets or in single quotes, and it runs just fine. But unfortunately, this is not true for all the cases. So for example, if I try to run this is the old get mailbox commandlet, which returns a list of all the mailboxes in which the username doesn't match the seal, the user principal name. Now, if I try to do the same with the get EXO mailbox commandlets or the new commandlets, we will see that the process actually fails. Unfortunately, the thing is that the new RESTful APIs there very like to what we have in the graph, unfortunately, don't support all the filtering, and they don't support all the filtering operators, and they don't support all the properties actually for filtering, and are quite limited, honestly, in this regard. So even basic filters like not equals or not like cannot, basic operators, I meant, sorry, like not equals or not like cannot be used. And when it comes to even some of the more useful types of filters that we had in Exchange Online, they might not work in some scenarios. In some scenarios, they will work. So it's hit and miss, and make sure to just confirm. So for example, this example, the next scenario here is I'm running a commandlet which will filter out just the recipients which are managed by a particular user in my organization. And if I try to do the same with the new commandlets, it works just fine. But the next filter, which is basically doing a similar, getting a list of recipients, but for which I'm a member of, my account is a member of, I can run it just fine with the old style commandlets. But if I now try to do the same with the new v2 commandlets, again, I run into an error, which is unfortunate. And yeah, the last example there basically is supposed to illustrate the issue that I mentioned previously, that some accounts which have properties, characters like the hash sign there in their user principal name will not be returned. Yeah, let's just run this. Because the hashtag character is not supported by the new commandlets, you again run into an error here. So yeah, I suppose at this point I can switch back to the slides and just talk a bit more, and then we'll switch to Ingo, who can give you the actual real life information there. So just bear with me for a second. I want to make sure that you have the list of the property sets here. You will have the slides available later on if you care about them. These are the stuff we already covered. I do want to mention as well that there might be some attributes missing in the output. If you care about them, there's just a very few of those, and you can just ignore them. But for the sake of completeness, as I have included them here. And you might also notice that some parameters are actually missing, but for the most part, again, the commandlets are pretty much backwards compatible. And the other differences that are worth mentioning, filters as we covered already, positional parameters, basically being able to do get EXO mailbox without using the identity parameter, which is now supported in the latest version. And another important thing is the object resolution, or basically the identifier that you need to provide for the object against which you want to run a given commandlet. So previously you could use a bunch of different identifiers there, but now with the switch to the REST APIs, as you are probably familiar from the Graph API, the external directory object ID is the primary attribute that we care about here, because the commandlets are then run directly into the Azure AD backend. But you can use some others like the UPN or Exchange GUID or the primary or any of the secondary email addresses. And if you want to use something like name or alias or stuff like that, or basically additional properties, you can use the -ANR parameter. And again, the team is working on expanding this list for the future. And yeah, this is basically stuff we already covered here. So let's switch to Ingo, who will give you now some additional details on how things work in his environment. And then if we have sufficient time, we will come back to the slides.
Yeah, thanks, Marcel. Now I have to speed up a little bit. Here, just first of all, at the beginning, what Marcel mentioned about the filtering here, this is a limitation of the graph. So we are now in between, at least two different infrastructures, and between the Exchange Online, PowerShell, and then also leveraging the graph in between. Bear this in mind in your scripts. What I want to talk about is also be lazy. Be lazy is really a good thing. So actually, I'm totally lazy. When I get requests every day, or I see that I get the same request frequently, I am definitely looking into writing a script or writing just as a simple function, But this also brings me to the next point, Keep things really simple. Don't try to solve everything with one huge script or module, whatever. I'm going to show you in a minute, what I'm talking about here, really. My most important part here is really, for the daily work, what you try or what you have to achieve, and you have a repeated task. Someone is asking for specific reports or for troubleshooting steps. That you always want to have the same steps for retrieving, hey, my active sync device or my Outlook for mobile, when did it try to sync the last time, stuff like that. Just write your own functions, and whenever you start up your daily work, import them and you have them handy. Maintain your functions in a file, right? This is then when you're just importing them. An example is what you can see is I published this on my GitHub. Yeah, you can see some of these functions actually. And let me just share my screen. So just let me know when you can you see my screen, Mazu?
Yes, Ingo, go ahead.
Now the question is which one? The one with the notepad or
I'll
the
see the
one with the
notepad, yes, the notepad plus. Okay, now I can see the PowerPoint.
Okay, then just give you an example here. I have the helper functions. For instance, here is these are all kind of helper function I built. Like search unified logs here, for example, is when you search the unified log, just to give you a hint for that, and you have a large amount of data, and you're trying to retrieve everything for them. It's gonna be pain in the ass actually, can be, and as a helper function, I just wrote this function here and then increase the result size, and I also incorporated the session ID, so I really get all the details definitely for something what I'm looking for. But here also to get EAS details, for instance, everybody is just asking me, hey, my device, when did it sync the last time here? And when I just run get yes, details there for my mailbox, it will retrieve it. The main, I have to write my name correctly. The main things what I'm looking for. So usually I'm looking at, for the device model, the OS, what is the device ID, the client type, and the access state, and also here the last sync and last access success sync time, stuff like this. Of course, you could do it also then manually, but then manually actually what you want to need to do is, you have to copy and paste this stuff, the whole stuff, which is actually the function. Then you have sort the object, select the object, and then the attributes what you're looking for. Do you really want to do this every day? No, just using the function, import them. That's totally easy. I have this in this file just in my repository, and I'm just importing it. Here in this case, just running it here like this, and it's imported, and I have all the functions there. That's definitely an improvement, and then for every day. And there's also much more stuff what we had to do for on-prem. Just bear in mind that's something what you can definitely do for your daily work. Just go back to the slides. Basil, can you take over again?
Just a second. So,
Yes.
share the screen. Can you see the slides now? Now, come on.
Not yet.
What about now?
Okay. Also, one thing is we're talking here about timestamps and cultures. Whenever you define or when you never connect to Exchange Online, Marcel showed it, you can just run Exchange Online there, but there's also the parameter PS session options. Define your culture and the UI culture and the idle timeout. The reason for that is, it's you have to handle it. Maybe like me, I'm in Germany, so I have to handle also data conversion and date conversion, also the timestamps here, and it can really a challenge. It can really be a challenge here, and of course later on you're really trying to export them the data, and then you don't know in which format that they are. Here you make sure they are in this really in the correct format. When you're running also Exchange Cmdlets, use the error action stop in your scripts, in your little functions, but bear in mind, keep it simple, because error action stop and then use the try catch for the results. With that, you are prepared for a lot of errors, and you can improve your results actually. Also, when it comes to Exchange Online, there's one thing definitely what you want to look for is, yeah, we have a great improvement in terms of resilience and connectivity, but there's still the possibility, and I have run into this every day, actually also when I run it against a large amount of mailboxes, objects, the PS remote transport exception. Do the try catch and look for these, and then you will see later on in some other screenshots, that sometimes you just have to reestablish a new session, even if it's reconnecting the Cmdlet or the new module. Sometimes it really needs some time, so you just have to wait a few seconds, so you're ending up in a new server. Also, but this is old knowledge actually, for each versus for each object. There is a huge difference. For each object, as mentioned, as it says already in the name, has it in the name, it really pipes or passes on the whole object. And yeah, for each object, you can do piping, you can have the begin, process, and end capabilities. But for each, when you do only for each, the statement for each, you will gain a lot of performance because every operation is really handled in memory, every object, and this is gives you in terms of performance a huge boost. So next slide, please. Yeah, just coming to the real life example here. There was, I ran into this actually last year. So we had to adjust the audit owner and delegation owner settings across all the mailboxes, all the user mailboxes. So that means, we had to reconfigure or check and maybe reconfigure over 130,000 mailboxes. So at that point in time, the new Cmdlet came out, the version 2, with the new EXO mailbox Cmdlet. And yeah, this was actually our approach. So we're gonna retrieve all the data, what we're gonna need there, validate it in a custom helper function, just what I showed you, what you have for a daily work, and then use the old Cmdlet set mailbox there for the correction. That's also one thing here is maybe we have that as a question, and but you can see that currently we have only the get Cmdlets. There is no set. Set is still the old fashion, the old Cmdlets. There is no new yet available. So, but anyways, our challenge was there. Even with the new module, we saw connectivity issues. Can you just move on, because I have here one of the screenshots. Vasil? Yeah. As you can see here, I had here, if you can see it on the top here, right, processing, and then I had the mailbox where I was processing, and then I run into the issue like here. It's as you can see, it's the PS remote transport exception, and you can see even here it's the actually the HTTP response there from the server actually. And even though I run into this issue, I just had to wait just a few seconds until one of the bad server got pulled out of the pool, and then it's reprocessed all of the, no, it's resumed there where it was, the script. So even though with the new model, that's why I mentioned this, it's always good to do the try catch operation. Maybe you can also use the new or the start robust command there. Module, but bear in mind the start robust command module doesn't support currently the new Cmdlets, so you won't be able to leverage them. Maybe we can create an issue at GitHub and ask if you can incorporate them. But as of now, the new Exchange module and the start robust command are completely different. They're not compatible with. So maybe you can, next slide, please. So the workaround for this was, as you might have seen here also, we checked definitely for the PS remote exception and delayed the reconnecting. Also, what it makes sense, is process the objects in chunks. So we have seen that maybe 10 to 15,000 objects there are processing, in definitely gives you a better feeling, and then just reconnect. And again, use the try and catch, and don't forget the error action. I think then the next slide. Yeah, you can also see here it's definitely how that's from the real tenant here, how long it actually took to get from all the mailboxes the details. So we can see, you know, as Vasil mentioned, you know, I used also the filter recipient type details user mailbox. Result size is unlimited, and I was also then querying the properties audit owner and audit delegate. So it took barely 18 minutes to pull the data from all the mailboxes. And you can see here at that point in time, we had 131,000 or almost 132,000 mailboxes. Before the new Cmdlet, the new module, I wasn't even thinking about getting this, because of this we would have split and chunked, you know, queried all the mailboxes in chunks, you know, to retrieve the data. With the new module, even if it was 18 minutes, you know, that's fine. It's good. We made it. So maybe you can go to the next slide. That's just to the real life example. The question is for me now, is everything good? No, it's not, but the colleagues, they're working on it. You know, one of the example is here. One of my colleagues, he always complains about that, but yeah, he's right. It's like an on and off here. What you can see here is, you know, the get extra recipient, the recipient type I'm querying for the mail user. I'm just trying to retrieve the external email addresses here. And you can see, as you can see, it's with extra recipient, I don't retrieve them. With get recipient, I definitely retrieve them, but it takes longer, of course. That's one thing. The colleagues are working on it, but be aware of that's, you know, sometimes, yeah, you just have to have a look and then start questioning maybe the result. That comes on to the next slide. Yeah, be careful. Piping large amount of objects can be interesting. That's also what Vasil mentioned, you know, piping. What actually what you're doing is you have a large amount of objects, and your pipe means, you know, you throw them over the fence there to the next Cmdlet, and you will retrieve the output, or you realize that something goes wrong after all the objects got processed, and then first you retrieve data, and then you retrieve only error. You don't know when actually the error retrieved. Maybe you realize this with the old module when the access token expired after 1 hour. Then you retrieve, you know, at one point in time, access denied, access denied. This is actually one of the things. Avoid piping. Can be interesting, definitely. Then also know your environment. So that means whenever you run Cmdlets, and this is also for the old and for the new one, especially currently for the new one, if the results are definitely different than usually, you know, when you pull whatever, your daily, your weekly, or your monthly statistics, and then all of a sudden it looks completely different, don't take it as it is. Think about it. Maybe you just have to rerun it. And bear in mind, there is also, when it comes to multi-geo, there are still Cmdlets which doesn't support multi-geo. It means you have to connect. There's a link. There is a way where you have to really connect them to the other geo for that. Maybe next slide, but I think also we're done, and we're also almost on top of the hour.
Yes,
We have
thank
some
you.
resources here.
Thank you,
Yeah,
Ingo.
what are we
Yes,
gonna do?
sorry. So yeah, that's a list
What?
of resources basically linked to the presentations from Ignite that you can watch and get some additional information about the new commandlets. And there's also a link to the previous 2 webinars that we did with Aaron on the subject of optimizing Exchange Online PowerShell for running against a large number of objects. I've also embedded the simple examples that we run there in the PowerShell. Again, there's nothing that complicated in them, so they might not even be that useful for you. Now, I know we are pretty much running out of time, and I've tried to address some of the questions there in the chat, but because we did receive some questions as well, I would try to address as many of them as possible in the 1 minute or so that we have. So let's see. what about the robust cloud command module? We did cover this already. Yeah, it's recommended to use when you're using the outside of Cmdlets. So if you are not familiar with it, go ahead and download it, try and test it. So where to find an organized directory of various Microsoft and Office 365 Cmdlets? Well, the
That's the
docs.microsoft.com.
docs, I know.
Yep.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, I don't think there is a full list of all the modules and whether they support modern authentication or just basic authentication or need some hacks and stuff like that. Many of the MVPs have been actually compiling such lists. There are also some connectivity scripts which basically allow you to connect to multiple Office 365 services with a single script, and yeah, they cover all those additional details there. So another question we have is what to use, the REST-based PowerShell commandlets or the Graph API query via PowerShell. Well, the thing is that we don't actually have any support for Graph API currently for Exchange Online, and what we are seeing here is basically the initial attempt of Microsoft to cover this. Now, I didn't have much time to talk about it. Yeah, I tend to blah blah a bit, but there is actually a way for you to explore what Microsoft is doing in the backend. So if I simply switch to this slides here and show you what I mean. So basically, yeah, you can think of the new Exchange Online the RESTful commandlets as basically being powered by the graph on the backend. So if you are aware of how you can connect to the graph, you can do pretty much apply the same method for connecting to the Exchange, the new Exchange commandlet. So you need, well, you don't actually need the app display name, but I've included it for completeness. What you need is the application ID and some additional information like the resource URI and the response URI and so on. But as long as you have all this information, you can then manually fetch a token for the Graph API, and then you can use this to simply run queries against the graph. And here is basically an example of what you can, how you can get the corresponding endpoint. So if you see when I run the get exo mailbox commandlet via the -verbose -debug parameters, it actually goes and show me the actual query that has been run. So in this case, you have the endpoint here /admin API /beta. That's my tenant ID, and then we are querying a given mailbox here. But yeah, using this information, you can pretty much use the new Exchange Online commandlets the same way as you are using the Graph API, and I've added some additional information there on my blog. If you are interested, you can go ahead and check it. Yeah, I'll see you how we have. Not sure how we are actually
Yeah,
distributing.
this also answers the question. Oh, sorry. This also answers the question about MFA support because folks are talking or asking the question. Yeah, it supports MFA definitely because it's modern out.
Yes, thank you, Ingo. So yeah, one more question, I suppose, and then we can close it. And let's see. So the question is, moving forward, how is Exchange Online remote PowerShell management affected once deprecating basic authentication for multiple protocols, blah, 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 blah. So, okay, to give you the short answer here, first of all, Microsoft is the authority on this. We as MVPs do have some additional information that we are given, and sometimes we can actually share it with the public. But my point here is to get a proper answer, always talk to your Microsoft representatives on such questions. So the plan is, of course, to pull the plug on basic authentication later this year, October 13th. But Microsoft, of course, needs to provide us with the necessary tools for actually to be able to continue doing our jobs by using the Exchange commandlets, for example, in this scenario, or the different protocols used throughout Exchange. So they do plan to actually provide support where needed. I mentioned several times that this module, for example, has planned improvements in terms of being able to run on other PowerShell modalities such as PowerShell Core or directly into Azure Cloud Shell. And one of the other points that the team has repeatedly mentioned they are working on it is exactly this scenario, making sure that in situations where basic authentication is disabled, either client side or the server side, you can still actually perform your duties here. Yeah, so just stay tuned on what Microsoft is providing in this space, and rest assured that indeed they are actually working on this. So, Ingo, do you have actually any question you want to address? I mean, we will make sure to go over all the other questions probably in a separate blog post later on. Apologize for not having sufficient time to cover them. But if Ingo, for example, has some other questions he wants to address now, Ingo?
No, I think we're over time. We're gonna answer the question, also ask here in the chat, and then send it out later
Yes.
on.
With that, thank you very much for attending, and hopefully this was useful for you. Again, if you have any additional questions, don't hesitate to send this our way, and you can also send them directly to Microsoft by using the link, the email address of the DAO that you can simply get by connecting with the new methods. Thank you very much, everybody, and have a nice evening.
Yep. Bye.